Welcome to this video, and today we'll be having a look at functions. Very basic things for functions, and then we will end it for this session. Right, so what are functions? Function is a collection of statements that performs a specific task, right? And functions are commonly used to break a problem down into small manageable pieces, all right? So instead of having every code inside your main function, we can break them into separate manageable functions, and then we can later call them inside our main functions, right? So let's have a look at this, what we have right here. So assuming this is our main function, so we can have every code we want to write inside our main function, right? But that doesn't suit a good programmer. So what programmers usually do, good programmers usually do, is put their code into functions, codes that are performing specific tasks. You put them in their own functions, and you can later call them in your main function. So you see this side, we only have three statements here, and they can be you calling functions, right? So this could be one function with its own statement, another function with its own statement, and then you can come to your main function and then be calling them, and then you can have a clean code for yourself and other programmers too, right? So let's come back here, and we'll be looking at defining a function and calling a function, right? And then a function definition contains the statement that make up the function, and then a function call is the statement that causes a function to execute. So we are going to dive into our IDE and create some user-defined functions and see how this actually works. But before that, let's look at the format of a function, right? So this is our main function, the function you see when you open a C++ project, right? So with a function, we need what we call a data type, and then you need a function name. Then you can have a parameter that will be accepting arguments. Then your statement will come in here, then you can have your return value here, right? We will come back to this later. So let's dive into our IDE and create some user-defined functions. When we say user-defined functions, that is functions we are going to create, right? So there are inbuilt functions like the main function, the power function to calculate for the power of a number. There is a square function, other inbuilt functions, right? So today we are looking at how to create a user-defined function in C++, right? So let's start from the very basic things, and then we can build on it. First of all, let's try to build a function, a very simple function that is going to say hello world to the user or the console. Okay, so we say when we are creating a function, we need the return type, right? Return type, hello underscore return type. Then we can have the function name. Then we can have brackets open, brackets close with some kind of parameters, right? So let's leave that one out, and then we can have a body. Let's say you can have a statement for the function, and then we can end our function. In some cases, you will have to put your return value in there. All right, so using this structure, how do we create a function that prints hello world to the screen? So We have functions that return value, right? And functions that do not return value. And if you want to create a function that is not going to return a value, we use the void data type. All right. And if your function is going to return a value, you can use any other data type apart from void, right? So this time around, creating a function that prints hello world to the screen, we are not going to return any value. It's just printing the output to the screen, right? So we can do void as our data type for this function, and we can call our function greeting, open bracket for the parameter. And this is a very simple function where we are not going to accept any parameters, right? So we can get our structure and then print the message to the user and say hello world, right? This is a very simple function to output a message to a user, right? So this right here is function definition. You defining a function. And what do you need when defining a function? You need the return type, the name of the function. You bring these things here, and then the structure, the body statement of your function can come inside the open braces. All right, so let's come into our main function, and this is where we call our user defined function, right? So how do you call a function? By calling a function, you simply call it by its name and then the open braces. If it has parameters, you can put you have to put the parameters in there too. So let's simply call this greeting function, bracket open, bracket close, and then we can end this, and this is simply going to output run this greeting function inside the main function, right? So let's run this and we expect to see hello world, right? So we have this, and it's very simple, a function that does not return any value, right? So now let's build up on this and try to get a function that will say hello with the user's name, right? So this time around, we are going to pass one parameter to our function. So we see how that also works. So let's do void and function name greeting with or let's say greeting user. And this time around, we are going to accept a parameter, right? And with parameters, how you define them is they have a data type, right? So you give them a data type and then the parameter name, right? So we can do para name, right? And with this, you can have multiple parameters, right? Then again, you have to introduce a data type, then you can give it another parameter name, right? Yes. So this time around with our second function, we want to take the user's name, right? Which is obviously going to be a string. So we are going to use a string data type, and we can say we can use the name simply name for our parameter name. All right, then let's open brackets and then we can have our statements here. So we just want to say hello with the user's name, right? So let's say hello, and then we can print the name too. the screen. Right. So this time around, we are calling a function that accepts one parameter, right? So let's output a message to the user and then ask them to enter their name, right? So it says cout enter your name. Then we need a variable that will store the user's name, right? So we can do string name. All right, and this name here is going to be different from the name we have here, right? So let me do name from main function, right? Name from main. So that will be our variable name, and we are going to accept the value and place it into this variable. All right, and from there we are going to call this function the greeting user function. Then again, how do you call a function? With a function name, this time we are doing greeting user. All right, bracket open. Then we need to pass a parameter here, right? So we can do the name from main in here, and this right here is going to call this particular function, pass whatever value will be stored in this into the parameter here, and this parameter is going to be used inside this. So we are going to run this code. We have this from the first function, so we should see hello world, and we can do this to print out hello with what the user is going to enter. So we have hello world, and then the user is being prompted to enter a name, so we can do John. Then we have a message printing hello, the user's name, where we have John in this case, right? Yes. So this is basically how functions work, and you can do a lot of things with this, right? So let's create another function that will accept two parameters, right? So we can do, basically, let's do a function that will take the user's first name and then the user's last name. All right, that should be enough. So let's say void first and last name. This is a long function name, so we can do string and then say first name for the first variable, and another for the first parameter, then we can do last name for the second parameter. And this time around we are saying cout and then hello. We can do first name, then we can give some space and print out last name, and we are going to end with an end line. All right, so we first had a function with 0 parameters, right? Then we moved ahead with function taking 1 parameter. Now we are doing a function that accepts 2 parameters, and we are making use of that here. And mind you, this is a function that is not returning a value, so we keep on using the void return type, right? So let's go into our function, and then we are going to create variables to store the first name and last name, right? So I'm actually going to comment out these ones. So we can do multi-line comments with this. All right, so let's call our function. Before we call it, let's have a string that is going to accept let's do name1, then name2, right? Then we can output a message to the user saying enter your first name. Then we take that value and insert it inside name1, right? Then again we can ask the user to enter your last name, and we can do cin, then we can do name2. So this should actually be name1. All right, and after doing that, we can call the function, and the function name is first and last name, right? So let's call the function first and last name, and we are passing these parameters name1, name2. All right, then you end with a semicolon, right? Another thing you have to take note of is you realize that when you are defining the function, for the parameters, you give a data type and then a name, right? Another data type and a name. But when you are calling the function and you are passing parameters, you only pass the name, right? You don't do string and then the name. This is going to give you an error. So you just pass in the name value to it, all right? The compiler is going to understand this is a string value, right? If you declare it as something else, you are probably going to get an error. So let's run this, and we should have two prompts asking us for our first name. We can do John. Enter your last name, we can do Doe. Then we have hello John Doe. So very simple. You can try this and you should be fine, right? So now let's go to how we can create a function that retains a value, right? That reminds me of something. So we can actually make use of the return keyword, right, inside a void function, a function that is not returning anything. So let's do a function that divides a number, right? And you know, when you divide a number by 0, it's undefined, right? It's not something that works. So we usually output a message telling the user that dividing by 0 is not accepted or something, right? So let's create another void function. Let's do div num. All right, we are dividing two numbers, so let's do like a double, and let's do num1. You can do another double and say num2. And so we are going to use the if statement here. So when the user enters 0 for the divider, we are going to tell the user you can't divide a number by 0, right? So let's assume this is going to be our divider, right? So we do if this num2 equals 0. That means if the user enters 0 for this, then we can tell the user that So let's end this with a semicolon, and then on the next line we can do return, right? So if the number the user enters for the denominator is 0, we are going to tell them that we can't divide by 0, and we are going to return from the function. So if it is not, we can do else, or we can simply output a message in the function. I can do end line. All right, so we are going to call this function, and when the user enters 0 for the denominator, we simply output this message to the user, then we return out of this function, right? So even though this function is not returning a value, we can still use this to come out of the function, right? So but then if it's the number they entered is anything else apart from 0, we can actually do the division for the user, right? So let's add this to our comment, and then we can call the function here. Let's define two data, two variables that can store these values. So let's do number 1, then number 2. Then let's call the function. What is the function name? Let's check the function name, and we have divnum. So we call it by saying divnum bracket open. Then we can do number 1 and number 2. So instead of taking values from the user, let's actually assign them to a value. So this should be 0 for our first try, and then we can do 4 or even 10. So these values are going to be passed into our divnum function, right? And if the second parameter is 0, we can do division by 0, right? So let's run this. We have an error, so let's end this with a semicolon, and let's run again. We have this, and definitely we are saying sorry, I cannot divide by 0, and then we are breaking out of the function, right? So you see, from the function, after our return, we do have other statement that the quotient, we actually do the division, right? But because we have the return here, we are actually breaking out of this function, right? So let's use another number for this instead of 0, and run this again, and we expect to have the quotient to be 5, right? Okay. All right, so let's end this right here, and we are going to continue with another video on creating a function that returns a value, right? I'll see you in the next video.